1. This happened just over 2 years ago, during my first year at sixth form college. I was 16 at the time, I'm now 19. I usually got the bus home, since I was studying art and psychology, among other things, which usually meant I would be carrying home a pretty heavy sketchbook, as well as a couple of heavy binders full of notes. And I have back and chest problems, which meant I couldn't carry heavy stuff for too long. On days when I didn't have to bring as much stuff home, I would usually walk. It was about a half-hour walk between my college and my house, and I usually walked home with a friend. On this particular day, however, she had got a ride home from another friend, so I was walking by myself. It was also winter, so it was already dark by the time I set off home. To get to my house, I would usually walk through a park. I could either go through the actual park area, but that usually added around 20 minutes to my journey, since it was a pretty big park. There was also a pretty densely wooded area between the park and a housing estate, with a dirt path running through it, which is the route I usually took home, since it shaved about 10 minutes off my journey. Lots of people walked their dogs along the route, so I didn't really feel worried about walking that way. I usually just listened to music and walked on autopilot until I got to the main road. Because of how dark it was and how dense the trees were, it was really dark while I was walking down the path. It took me a while to realize it since I was walking fast and not paying much attention, but I noticed that there was a light flickering up ahead, partly hidden by the trees. As I got closer, I realized that the light was coming from a fire in the middle of the woodland area. There was a bonfire and a man standing by it, side on to the dirt path, and staring into the fire. He was pretty far away and I couldn't see him very well, but I could see that there was something in his hand. It was white, probably a letter or a photograph or something, and he was throwing something else into the fire. There were 2 black trash bags on the ground near him. If it wasn't for the light of the fire, I wouldn't have seen him. I thought it was kind of suspicious. But we weren't too far from a residential area, so I assumed he was burning some old letters, bills, bank statements, whatever. Stuff with personal information on them that you couldn't just throw away. In all honesty, it was weird, but I didn't think too much of it, and just kept walking. It would only take me a few minutes to get to the road near the residential area, and then it was a 5-minute or so walk to my house. I was near the tree line when I glanced over my shoulder and saw the man standing in the middle of the dirt path, about 25 feet behind me. He hadn't put the fire out, since I could still see the light from it through the trees. He started walking towards me, slowly at first, before starting to run, shouting something at me, but I couldn't tell what it was he was saying. Luckily, I hadn't stopped walking while looking back, and I was already close to the main residential road. So I sped up and crossed. I rounded a corner and hid behind a fence, and glanced up to see him looking around, presumably for me, before going back into the tree line. I made it home quickly, without further incident. After that, when I walked by myself, I stopped cutting through the wooded area, and taking the longer route through the park instead. I never saw the man again, and since I'm attending a different course at a different school and no longer visiting that park, I doubt I ever will. So man burning things on a bonfire in the woods, I don't know if you were just innocently burning junk mail or not, but I hope you stopped chasing teenage girls through the woods, and let's not meet again. 2. I am a female corrections officer, prison guard or CO, in a state with a relatively high number of death row inmates. However, few executions are actually carried out. I used to work for a large county, but I work for a different agency now. This county was my first CO job years ago, and before that I had worked in retail and customer service while studying criminal justice. So so I was really green. I used to be very liberal. I'm still liberal about a lot of things. But the job does change your perspective for most people. One thing that I used to believe very strongly was that no human being could be truly evil. This particular county jail is one of the oldest in the country. So parts of it have a totally linear layout. What I mean is that you have a long stretch of corridor with cells on either side, and the COs have to walk up and down to supervise the inmates. I'm actually giving enough information for anyone with good Google Foo skills to figure out a lot. As you can imagine, these linear layouts are not in style anymore because you cannot see every cell at the same time. But every inmate can see you. I have to say that units like this are extremely creepy too. I am going to call this corridor the condos. We did not call it that, but I do not want to share the exact term which is specific to this jail. Less than 10 years ago, a quadruple stabbing homicide happened not far from where I grew up. The murderer, Michaels, described it as a butchering, and he killed his former girlfriend, her family, and their neighbor, because he came over when he heard the screams. When the police found Michaels soaked in blood and asked him what happened, he said, "It's obvious. I just killed everyone." The cops said that he seemed completely emotionless when he said it. At that time, I had only been a CO for about 4 months, and our facility received him as a pre-trial detainee. Now, obviously, he wasn't our first or only murderer, but the nature of the crime. Stabbings indicate a more dangerous personality than a shooting, for one thing, and his lack of remorse was horrifying. He was considered a volatile inmate, so we placed him in an observation cell in the middle of the condos where a CO could always keep an eye on him. He would stand at his glass door in silence most of the day, just watching everyone. I swear he only really spoke when he had visits. He actually had a full visits list of these big goth girls who would come in and swear they were in love with him. I don't know if this means anything, but his ex was a big girl, and he used to draw pictures of the fat female COs. For note, he was skinny and white with brown hair. One day I was working as a utilities officer, basically a floater who relieves people for breaks and helps out as needed. At this jail, utilities officers also got away with a ton of downtime and BSing. I was hanging out at one end of the condos where you could look down and see a lot of the jail, talking to another officer on duty. As they say, there are no secrets in jail, plus I was aware that there were points throughout the jail where you could hear very well into neighboring cells, that sort of thing. We were being pretty quiet though, plus we stood a good 50 yards from Michael's observation cell. Also, you have to imagine, it would be difficult to stand in the observation cell and press your face against the glass to see people standing at a right angle so far from you. I was telling the other CO a funny story about my weekend, which I wouldn't do on a correctional unit nowadays. But we weren't getting into anything too personal either. It was a long story involving my fiancée at the time. I wrapped up talking to this CO because I had to go to a gate to relieve another officer for chow, and I had to pass Michael's cell. I didn't like walking past it because he stood there and stared at you, and back then I wasn't so good at hiding my nervousness. He always had his head slightly tilted down, so you could see the white under the irises of his eyes. Again, rarely saying a word, but today was different. I took one step past his door and heard him say, "Edgecombe," in a barely audible whisper. I didn't even know he knew my name. Yes, our last names are on our uniforms, but I was never his primary officer, and we'd never interacted. It caught me off guard, so instead of ignoring it, it stopped me in my tracks, and I backpedaled to the door. He pointed to his mouth, and I leaned in to listen. His eyes looked so dark. I remember I felt hypnotized. He proceeded to recite word for word the story I had just quietly told the other officer at the end of the condos, less than 2 minutes before, even copying the sound of my voice down to a subtle lisp. This seemed to go on forever. I felt like we were the only two there. No 22 millimeters of glass protecting me, just a 5-foot-tall female and a murderer. I remember thinking for the first time of another human being. This is evil and unfixable. Finally I said, "Sir, did you need something?" He started to laugh hysterically and I walked away. I've been assaulted by other inmates. I've had piss thrown in my eyes. People play mind games with me constantly. I've met some damn good lip readers too, but this was something else. Now I work at a maximum security institution, where I babysit all rapists and murderers and pedophiles. I don't know how to make it make sense to you that this was the one and only time in my life where I felt inside of me like I was dealing with something not human. Michaels is in another institution now. He's on death row. He refuses to appeal. He made it clear to the press that this decision is not out of remorse. He has none. He just doesn't give a shit, and it is most logical in his mind for him to die. Inmate Michaels, if you ever do get out somehow, please, let's never meet again. 3. I had just moved out of my parents, and with my very wealthy girlfriend named Brittany. We were both young and able females just out of high school, and wanting to taste freedom, with some well-deserved love on the side. So together we found a pretty nice 2-story house that was going for a very good price. It was even in a great part of the city, which was convenient for Brittany's job at her father's office. We should have known the price was a little too good to be true, but at the time we naively jumped at the chance in a heartbeat. As we were moving our stuff in, we were immediately greeted by Gracie. Gracie was our middle-aged neighbor, who was just dying to know all about us the moment we arrived. I still remember her short brown hair that sat upon her head in shambles as it matched her equally colorless clothing. Her formal attire made me feel like I had just walked into a job interview instead of my new neighborhood. She insisted on bringing some of her pastry dishes for dinner that night. But as we had made plans to eat out already, we promised her another time. Looking back, I wish we hadn't made that promise. The next day, Brittany and I were working on the living room when a happy 3-note knock came at the door. It was Gracie, with several small cases of breads and other pastries inside. Before I could make 2 cents of the unexpected arrival, Gracie was already making a beeline to the kitchen, insisting we eat some dinner. I wasn't exactly pleased with this, but Brittany assured me she had good intentions. So after whipping up a few sandwiches from the fridge, we sat down at the small kitchen table with her. Boxes and boxes of our unpacked things crowded the kitchen, making for a cramped space. But Gracie didn't seem to care as she rattled off question and question. It wasn't long before she started talking about the church she was part of, and how she had been going to it for decades. It was fascinating and a little unsettling how she talked about the church, watching her eyes look up as if she was preaching the direct word of God. It didn't take long for Gracie to ask us to come by the church this coming Sunday. She even gave a sly smile and said the choir boys were a fine sight to behold alone. It was at this moment that Brittany replied that if there were any choir girls that were as fine as the boys, she'd definitely stop by. Immediately, Gracie's big smile became a state of silent shock, to a look of utter disgust. "Oh, I see," she muttered quietly. In what felt like a flash, Gracie picked up her now empty cases and headed straight to the door. It was quite obvious what had offended her, but I still felt the need to go after her. As I called out her name, she spun around, as her narrow stare met my eyes. "This house is damned!" And with that, Gracie smashed one of the glass cases onto the floor and made her way out. As I went to close the door, Gracie was screeching what I think were scriptures from the Bible as she stormed down the sidewalk. As I cleaned the glass, Brittany was laughing uncontrollably at what had just happened. While Gracie was certainly out of line, I didn't see any humor like Brittany did. Just 2 days in and the neighbor already hates us. It wasn't until 2 months later that we heard from Gracie again. It was nearing Halloween and I was setting up decorations for the front of the house. Pumpkins, skeletons, the works. As I was pasting some stickers onto the window, I heard a familiar voice come from behind me. "It's not too late, you know." I turned to see Gracie, dressed in all black, like she was going to a funeral. "The Lord will forgive you and your friend, but you must listen to me." I still felt bad for before and wanted to try rebuilding a healthy relationship with this neighbor. So I asked her what she wanted to do. She apparently needed to bless us and our house, as well as put us on strict religious regiments. I calmly told her that we needed to find alternate, non-religious ways to make things right. Gracie wouldn't even hear it. She threw a small Bible at me, telling me to read the Word of God and that she would be back the next day, and briskly walked back into her house. I, in turn, returned to decorating with no interest in reading the Holy Book. I didn't even bother telling Brittany, since I knew she'd just make it worse. Well, the next morning, before Brittany and I were even awake, we were awoken to loud noises coming from the front yard. Brittany decided to check it out, as I still wanted to sleep. It wasn't long before I heard Brittany yelling profanity outside, so I brought myself out of bed to see what was going on, and what I saw was shocking. There were pumpkin and skeleton pieces all over the front yard, ripped orange and black streamers blowing away in the wind, and torn stickers on the front porch. Lo and behold, it was Gracie. As she held streamers and pumpkin pieces in her hands, Brittany was yelling in her face. Did this woman really destroy all of her decorations? Gracie saw me and demanded to know if I had read the Bible. I couldn't even get a word in. Brittany was demanding she leave at once, or the police would be called. Gracie, obviously not wanting that, tore off back to her house. It was at this point I realized this was a problem that I didn't want, and certainly didn't need. After that, Gracie resorted to putting Bibles on our doorstep every night, and sometimes even preaching in front of our house. This was usually met with Brittany running out and scaring Gracie away. This made me very uneasy, and Brittany especially angry. We tried going to the police, but they seemed reluctant to do anything. They constantly promised to go talk to her, but I don't think they ever did. Part of me thinks it's because they had bigger problems than little old ladies that threw Bibles and glass cases, but another part of me thought mine and Brittany's sexuality could be a factor as well. I spent numerous nights crying as Brittany held me. This wasn't the dream we envisioned living together. Things came to a boil a few days into December. I was just finished snow shoveling when I found myself being pushed out of the way as Gracie headed towards my house. I didn't even notice her coming. I demanded to know what she was doing. She made her intentions clear as day. She was going to bless us and the house, whether we liked it or not. I wasn't having any more of this. "No, you may not bless us or our house." Gracie shook her head and said we would thank her eventually. It was then Brittany came outside and kept Gracie from going into the house, as I called the police. What I didn't notice was that Gracie went for the snow shovel until it was too late. She began trying to smash the living room windows, which I assumed she was doing for a way to get in. However, she only managed to shatter a few small panes. Before she could do more, Brittany ripped the shovel out of her hands. With that, Gracie fled to her house, screaming, "Lord, cleanse my soul! Lord, cleanse my soul! Beasts! Beasts!" and slammed her door. After that, we decided it was best to move in with Brittany's family, as we looked for a new place to live. Yes, we were doing nothing wrong, and could have kept fighting, but we didn't want things to escalate any further with Gracie. We were out at the end of December, but that whole month, we didn't see Gracie at all. That is, until we drove away from the house, one final time. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Gracie speaking some words through her front window. Was it another verse from the Bible? A death threat? Hell, maybe a moment of clarity, asking for forgiveness. I don't know for sure. But there's one thing I do know. Gracie, let's not meet again. Hey everyone, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 153. Of course, before anything else, I'd like to say thank you very much to everyone who allowed me to use their stories in this video. I would also, of course, like to say that you could probably work out who the guy in the second story was simply by Googling that quote. Do it, comes right up. I'm not going to say his name here, just out of respect to the author of the story, but they even say themselves in the Reddit post in the comment section they weren't really going out of their way to hide who it was. So if you want to find it, that's how you do it. Well, here we are in December, once again. Snuck upon us, a sneaky little bugger. Got all my Christmas shopping done, actually. I got to jump on it this year. I actually did it in November. Just my niece and my nephew. Nephew's older now, so he usually gets money, and my niece was a few things she wanted. So I got those, plus a couple of little extra things as a surprise for her. I'm sure she'll like. You know, I'm not religious at all. I suppose I'm an atheist if you want to be accurate about it, but I do actually enjoy the vibe at Christmas time. It's always been one of my favourite times of year. Especially the past few years, because it means we get extra Doctor Who. Okay, I think it's time I headed off now, so until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.